Ready? Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Bob Barnhart. I'm the president of the Greater Lansing United Nations Association. I just want to say I'm just delighted to have all of you here. And also I want to welcome all of you who are on Zoom with us this evening. We will be talking about water as a human right. Just for those who are present here for a moment, just a little notice that if you need to use restroom, that they're out this door out here and up the stairs. There's also a ramp if you need that. So that's available. I do want to take a moment and thank those on my planning committee and those who were helped out with some of the other items for this evening. I want to thank Terry Link and John Metzler and Dave Wiley, Lisa Berg, also Hakan Yildiz and Bruce Wheaton for all their help in making this happen this evening. And I will be introducing, we have 3 speakers this evening, and I will be, of course, very grateful for them and for their being available for us to help us understand this issue of water as a human right and to just better educate us on this. Clean water and sanitation is one of the sustainable development goals. It's number 6. And so we have that information. I also want to thank our sponsors for this evening. In addition to the Greater Lansing United Nations Association, we are also sponsored by the United Nations Association of the Greater Detroit Chapter, and we're grateful to have them with us. The Peace Education Center, FLOW, which stands for Love of Water, the League of Women Voters of Greater Lansing, and the Clean Water Action. So we're grateful for their co-sponsorship and helping with promoting this, and welcome the members of those organizations who are with us this evening. Our first speaker this evening, we are delighted that we were able to secure State Senator Kristen McDonald-Rivet. And she is the senator from District 35 up in Saginaw Bay City area. Senator McDonald-Rivet is serving her first term in the Michigan Senate. Throughout her career, she has worked for systemic change to improve employment and educational opportunities, to revitalize neighborhoods, increase youth development programs, and create public policy addressing institutional inequity issues. Prior to being elected to the Senate, she served as the executive director of the Michigan Head Start Association. She was vice president of Michigan Future Inc. and president and CEO of Greater Midland Inc., which oversees 6 community centers in Midland County. She was also a Bay City commissioner and served as chief strategy officer for the Michigan Health Improvement Alliance. McDonald-Rivet has a bachelor's degree from Michigan State University and a master's degree in education and public administration from the University of Michigan Flint. I think she's got both her bases covered that way here in this state. But it is my pleasure to bring up to the podium here Senator Kristen McDonald-Rivet. Senator.
Thank you. I'm going to give me 1 second, see if we can get that. Does that work okay? Yes. Okay. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I have all the bases covered from a Michigan State U of M standpoint, but I'm also the mom of 6 kids. So I feel like I have paid tuition at every public and some of the private institutions all over the state. We've got 1 left at home, and the rest are, we got 1 left in undergrad, 1 left at home, and everybody is off to their graduate work. I also am a former East Lansing resident. So I lived in East Lansing for 20 years before moving to Bay City, and love this town, and am a lifetime aficionado of Ella's Teco to Popo salad. Okay. So I just want to say thank you so much. I want to talk a little bit about the clean water bill that we're moving through the state legislature, and talk a little bit about the political climate in the state legislature. I am a first-term state senator. This is the first time I've ever run for partisan office, but spent my entire career around public policy. It's been a bit of a wild ride. So we've been a little bit busy. I don't know how closely you all track what's happening in the state legislature. But we have in the first 10 weeks repealed the 1931 abortion restriction law. We have repealed right to work. We've restored prevailing wage. We've quadrupled the working families tax credit. We repealed the retirement tax. And today, I know that's not why we're here, but I'm going to do it anyway because you gave me a microphone. Today, the first public act that will have my name on it is a part of the gun sense legislation that will put protections in place and keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people. So thrilled by that. So thrilled by this. So we've been really busy, but I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you today about the values and principles that we're advocating for and the things that are gathering you here. So when we think about clean water and the fundamental human rights, these are things that we literally got blisters going door to door talking to people about what we were running. Through the course of our campaign, we knocked down over 75,000 doors and talked about basic human rights, freedom, that freedom of people in this country, which is everything from having access to clean water, to having financial freedom, to having freedom, healthcare privacy, control of our own bodies, those sorts of things. And as we were doing it, we were really criticized. And we're still facing attacks for that. I always think, you're on the right path when people are attacking your actions. So what's exciting about where we sit in the legislature now, I'm at that 50 like glasses on, glasses off space. So sorry if this is distracting for folks, but we got to talk about them during the campaign. We were able to change the political trajectory of the state legislature. But the cool thing about the last 10 weeks is we actually get to do now the things that we've been talking about for years, for over a decade. So whether they're easy or hard, we're doing exactly what we told everybody we would do. And I'm really proud of that. For over a year, I told everyone that I support water as a fundamental human right. It was on every piece of literature. It was something that I talked about at every door. Literally, I went door to door with my team and knocked on doors talking about that. So for me, it's black and white and is a core tenet of not just where I stand, but where many members of the Senate Democratic Caucus stands. But it has to be more than a belief. So it fits nicely on a yard sign, basic human right. It's a fundamental human right. But what is important is where we're putting our action. So before I decided to run for the Michigan Senate, I was a Bay City commissioner. You heard about that in my bio. When we were, and it's, Bay City is a tiny town, it's about 30,000 people. We had to make decisions that around local infrastructure. And one of the things that I was really proud to support and lead on was the really basic getting rid of lead water lines. So now I'm really proud and that I'm one of the co-sponsors of Senate Bill 25. I don't know if you've put out any information about that, but this is the legislation that a lot of people are calling the Human Right to Water Act. When it's passed, what it's going to do is codify that every individual in Michigan has the absolute right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water. The co-sponsors on this are almost the entire Democratic caucus in the Senate, including your own state senator, Sam Singh. So over the last decade or so, Michigan has had more than enough of our disinvestment in the infrastructure, and we've had more than enough large-scale incidents to make this legislation necessary. I have to say that as a mom and as a resident and as somebody that worked around clean water when I was a student at Michigan State, it is amazing to me that we need this kind of legislation, but we absolutely do. We've seen that not just in what happened in Flint, but all over the state. We have to enshrine it in our statute for the state departments to prioritize it, for state departments to use all the reasonable means to ensure safe and affordable water is access to everyone. It also provides a foundation in statute that when that right is not acknowledged, it's possible to take legal action, which is we've seen multiple cases of why that's important. So Senate Bill 25 is intended to address all the barriers to safe, clean water. Some of these barriers have to do with old pipes. Some of them have to do with economic fragility among families and in communities. We need to be mindful of all the influencing factors, which is why the bill targets all of the state departments, every single state department. So Benton Harbor and Flint's lead water crisis get a lot of major media coverage, and rightfully so. And they certainly helps to raise the public consciousness around the issue. But there are not the only communities who have suffered a result of unsafe water. Michigan is surrounded by the largest fresh water in the world, but citizens across our state have faced challenges combating forever chemicals like PFAS, which is a really big problem across the state, contaminated environments, and aging infrastructure that has caused generational damage to children and families. All over the country, lead lines are being removed from service. We can't all thrive unless all of us thrive. We must act urgently, and that all of our citizens, regardless of zip code, in every corner of our state, trust what's coming out of their taps. In 2010, Kalamazoo had one of the largest inland oil spills in US history. The contamination of the Kalamazoo River put citizens at risk and resulted in over $1 billion to clean up. $1 billion. So when we prioritize water as a human right, we can improve our quality of life, prevent long-term harms, and reduce long-term costs. Just for perspective, in Michigan in education, we spend $1 billion a grade. That one spill would educate every single third grader in Michigan. That's the context of what this costs us. It's pretty common phrase by leaders. Tell me your values and show them to me in your budget. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about what is in the budget that was presented by the governor and has wide support right now in the legislature. So first, need my glasses for these numbers. $280.5 million for water infrastructure projects to provide loans, grants, and direct funding to local communities. Those are dollars that are on top of local community funding. Second, $200 million one-time investments for lead service line replacements in significantly disadvantaged communities. And an additional $12 million will be an ongoing investment in future budgets. Third, $23.8 million for the management of groundwater resources. This data will allow for the preservation and effective future management of a resource from which approximately 40% of Michigan communities draw their drinking water from. Finally, I also want to say that while this is a historic investment, ensuring that every Michigander has access to clean water, there are measures that we have to have happen now. So some of them are large, some of them are small. I sit as the vice chair of the Senate Energy and Environment Committee. Last week, we passed out Senate Bills 88 and 89 that require water filters to be used in schools and childcare centers. It is shockingly common for lead to be in water and have owners of facilities and houses not know that it exists. So it's through these small changes in the investments in water resources that I think is really critical to achieving this space of basic human rights outlined in Senate Bill 25. So the first step is that we codify it. We hold it there for now and for future generations. The second step is that we put our money where our mouth is, our money where our values are, and we fund clean water in the state budget. And then lastly, that we continue to look across every program, every state department, everything we do, and really thinking about how we can start to turn the trajectory around water as a human right and have it not just be a platitude, but rather something that is visible and tangible in our communities. So the question would be, and I'd love to take questions, but let me just say, okay, Senate Bill 25, great, what do we do? So what I would really encourage you to do, so right now it was introduced with a lot of support in the Senate. It was referred to the Senate Housing and Human Services Committee, chaired by Senator Jeff Irwin, really good guy from Ann Arbor. I mean, we forgive him for that, but he's from Ann Arbor. Call your senator, regardless of if you're here or whether you're, I don't know where folks online are coming from, but call your senator and say, you not only support Senate Bill 25, but you want to see it move. So it's very hard for someone to oppose it. It's really easy for someone not to take action on it. So that, I think, is the big piece. The other is that as you see pieces of legislation come forward, is these groups that are supporting and sponsoring this event today. Clean Water Action is a really good example that puts legislation forward. Call your legislator, email your legislator, tell them how important these things are. That advocacy actually matters quite a bit. What doesn't necessarily matter is filling out a form where all you're doing is adding your name and they've filled in all of the pieces for you. Those tend to get less attention. But calling your legislator and talking about the importance of water. My particular passion is thinking about what it looks like in disadvantaged communities. Environmental justice has been a long time goal and part of my career. But your legislators are right down the road. They're people just like everybody else. Call and talk to them. And when you can, when things are a little slower in the legislature, stop by their offices. They're right. We're all right down the road. So I'd love to, if we have time, take some questions if anybody has them. Oh, that was easy. Yeah. Hi.
Where do you expect this to move? And as you introduced all the things you just got through, where does this sit at the hierarchy? When will it get out of committee?
Well, the sponsor, the chief sponsor is Senator Rosemary Bear, who is a passionate champion. And the first 7 priorities that I listed at the top were priorities of both the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. Where there were identical bills introduced in the House and the Senate, and we moved with speed. We felt like that was really important in setting the agenda. We just headed into a legislative break for the next 2 weeks. And then when we come back is when we are moving on the bills that were introduced and have been kind of sitting there until the first 7 priorities got done. So there is still quite a bit of work to do in the legislature on the budget. We hope to have a budget based on our values completed into the governor's desk by the beginning of June. So that process is happening. And at the same time, the first introduced Senate bills will start to move. So it's a very long politician-y, winded answer to say that I would expect that it will move in April or May. It'll move faster if you call and tell people you want it to move. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate a lot of, thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for caring about these things. Thanks for coming out on a Thursday night. And I will hand the microphone back.
Senator Kristen McDonald-Rivet, thank you so very much. And I thank you too. She's had a long 3 days of session and it's got to drive back to Bay City. So you are excused to hit the road. Thank you so much. Thank you, your staff too. I do have the pleasure now to introduce our next speaker. He will be joining us on Zoom, Jeremy Orr. And Jeremy is a Detroit-based attorney and a law professor at Michigan State University College of Law. Jeremy Orr is the Director of Litigation and Advocacy Partnerships for Earth Justice, where he leads the organizational strategy on engaging and partnering with communities and other stakeholders. Prior to Earth Justice, he served as a senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council on the Safe Water Initiative. Mr. Orr specializes in environmental and civil rights law with a primary focus on ensuring that overburdened communities have access to safe drinking water. Mr. Orr also serves as the vice chair of the Michigan Environmental Rules Review Committee and as a member of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So we're delighted to have Jeremy Orr with us. Jeremy?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to the Greater Lansing United Nations Association for having me today for this program. And it's great to follow, Senator McDonald Rivet, right? I think she laid the groundwork for some of the fixes for some of these local water issues that we face here in Michigan. And what I'll talk about today kind of shows why we need those legislative fixes now, right? We needed them like yesterday. So I'm grateful for her and her leadership on these water issues, particularly this human right to water bill, and just how we ensure that everybody has access to sufficient, safe, affordable water moving forward. So I'll talk a bit about just drinking water issues, clean water issues, and kind of tie them into our what we face kind of locally around Michigan. So just kind of a brief. I'll kind of do an intro with some key themes, talk about drinking water, talk particularly about sanitation issues, and then, ways to address particularly some of those sanitation issues from a holistic community standpoint. As was mentioned, I work part-time teaching water law at Michigan State University College of Law, but I work full-time at an organization named Earth Justice, a large public interest environmental law firm where I serve as a director of litigation and advocacy partnerships. And prior to that, I worked at Natural Resource Defense Council as a senior attorney on our Safe Water Initiative, which was our source to tap drinking water program, and had a lot of time working in and around Michigan on litigation and policy issues. So as I start to talk about water justice in particular, I frame it in the context of both first environmental justice and then water justice, right? So I always try to get those definitions out on the table with, environmental justice being the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development and implementation, enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And then there are many different, definitions of environmental justice as well as water justice. And as I teach in my water law class, we use a particular textbook that focuses on international and domestic water justice and has a couple of definitions of it. But just a most basic definition for water justice being that water justice acknowledges and addresses the disproportionate burdens faced by communities of color and low-income communities experiencing water issues. And part of that, water justice is safe water, drinking water, and sanitation as a right. As you all know, as members of the local United Nations Association, the United Nations recognizes water, a human right to safe and sufficient water and sanitation. There are 4 states within the U.S. that have constitutional rights to a healthy environment, including safe water. Most recently, the state of New York passed that via ballot measure. And one of the other states that has a pretty strong right to, human right to a clean environment that's been litigated and enforced is Pennsylvania. And, going back to this, one of the things I'll say is, as we think about this human right to water in Michigan, when that passes, and I'm very optimistic that it will pass, of course, right, I'd imagine it'll get challenged in court, and then that's going to be one of the things that strengthens that right to water once it goes through the legislature. So, I'd imagine that's something that'll come down the line. Key themes in water justice that I always point out are water quality, when we think of lead, PFAS, things of that sort, access, affordability, when we think about how much does water cost, are we being shut off from water, and then vulnerability, particularly the communities that are hit the hardest. And from a practical standpoint, I look at water as contamination being, again, lead, other metals, pollutants, bacterial contamination, and then reporting and monitoring. But from a policy standpoint, how do we address these practical issues, or what are the causes of some of these practical issues? Are looking at water issues oftentimes being very hyper local. Data collection is often lacking, and water data is spatially and temporally variable across the country and across the state, for that matter. Also, just do a kind of a quick reminder of oftentimes the difference between the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act. At the most basic level, I just describe them as the Safe Drinking Water Act being the water that comes out of your tap in your home, and the Clean Water Act being the water the source of that drinking water, right? The water that needs to be protected in our lakes, our rivers, our streams, our groundwater. So before it gets to our drinking water system, before it gets to our tap. It was passed in 74, regulates about 100 contaminants. And there are three main violation categories: health-based, monitoring and reporting, and public notification, as well as other violations. And what I'll talk about today is just some of the disproportionate impacts of water, starting with a really great report out of Natural Resources Defense Council named Watered Down Justice. It looked at the relationship between socio-demographic characteristics and drinking water violations. And the report, confirmed what we already knew anecdotally, which was that, some communities were disproportionately impacted by water issues more so than others. Those communities were communities of color, low-income communities, areas with non-native English speakers, areas with people living under crowded housing, and areas with more people that lack access to transportation. Is a quote that I pulled out from this really significant report that always kind of stands out to me. Of all of those factors studied in this report, race had the strongest relationship to slow and inadequate enforcement of the law. In fact, drinking water systems in places with the highest proportions of their populations that were people of color tended to spend more time out of compliance with the law for more violations, for more contaminants. And on top of that, even when problems were identified and enforcement actions were taken, the problems remained uncorrected despite those actions. So communities in which drinking water violations and race intersected were found all over the country. So to break that paragraph down a little bit, which I think is important to do, here's what that paragraph said of the findings of that report. Communities of color experienced drinking water violations at higher rates. They experienced more violations for more contaminants, meaning multiple contaminants. Their water system spent longer periods of time out of compliance. So, when there were violations, the water system tended, to spend much longer out of compliance. And then the thing that I think is really important to understand is even when problems were identified and government enforcement action was taken against these water systems and water utilities, the problem still went unfixed. Another report that I tend to refer to and refer people to is Watercolor, a study of race in the water affordability crisis in American cities. It was produced by NAACP Legal Defense Fund in 2019, and it looked at a number of communities all over the country to look at access and affordability. It looked at what it called America's water affordability crisis and the impacts on low-income families of color, particularly in Black communities. And the findings weren't, of course, not that different from the findings in the aforementioned study by NRDC on water quality in communities of color. And in these communities are disproportionately impacted by the cost of water. So, we're moving beyond the access to clean water, drinking water, and now into the space of who can afford water. Even if we are saying that it's safe to drink, can you afford it? And of note, right, this report kind of points out is the cost of water has doubled over the last 10 years. In some places it's tripled, which I always find interesting because the consumption of water hasn't necessarily increased in many of the places where you've seen the cost double and triple. And it has risen faster than the cost of gas and groceries by and large over the last 10 years. This report had a number of findings, and some that I tend to point out because we see it here in Michigan and have seen it here in Michigan over the years. Black homeowners are more likely to have a water lien placed on their home, resulting in property tax foreclosures and the loss of their home. If they aren't able to pay their water bill, it then at some point goes into arrearages, gets attached to your property taxes, and potentially your home goes into foreclosure. We've seen that. You're more likely to lose your family, right? In many states, lack of running water in a home is a factor in determining if a parent is fit to retain their child. And then lastly, right, the criminalization of accessing water was a factor, meaning that there are people when their water's turned off, they go outside, figure out how to turn it back on so that their family and children can have access to water. And that in many states is a misdemeanor. In some states, it's actually a felony, believe it or not. And oftentimes when I talk about this, you hear a lot of a lot of states say, well, they don't enforce it, right? It's on the books, but we don't enforce it. But just the fact that some of these rules are on the books and some of these laws are on the books and can be enforced is often troublesome, right? So when you think about quality of water and access, often, kind of point out, what's going on here at home in Michigan. Nobody needs a primer on the Flint water crisis. We're all highly aware of what happened there and how that played out with the lead water crisis, which for us, as we talk about a human right, more than just a water issue, but a democracy issue, right? We saw a majority Black low-income cities stripped of their democratic power to govern themselves, which led to this water crisis. And then we'll move into kind of the Benton Harbor water crisis, which we saw a couple of years ago, very similar to Flint, only that even if Flint happened kind of in a short window of a vacuum, Benton Harbor was a crisis that lingered for 3 years before action was taken. So we knew Benton Harbor was in violation, but yet the state and federal government failed to take action. And again, thinking about that report from NAACP years ago goes back to even when these communities are in violation, they tend to spend more time out of compliance. Benton Harbor is a great example of that, which has since been, the pipes in Benton Harbor have been replaced since a federal petition was filed and moved in that direction. And then lastly, just thinking about a place like Detroit, where you think about an affordability crisis. I think the United Nations a few years back, when Detroit shut off 40,000 households from water. 40,000, right? Tens of thousands in a one summer window, really in a 1 year window. The United Nations called it an egregious human rights violation. And here we are in the city of Detroit, where cost of water is still, pretty significant, pretty high. And as we look at, we talked about a lot of moratoriums happening during the pandemic, and those moratoriums have ended. That's prompted a lot of these water laws and water bills that we're seeing to keep access to water. Detroit's a place where you're going to have tens of thousands of people at risk of losing water now that the shutoff moratoriums have been lifted. And then, I'll kind of finish up with sanitation justice here. Giving, sanitation justice, just a simple definition, means ensuring that people from all backgrounds have equitable access to functioning sanitation systems. Meaning that all people have, a safe place to meet bodily needs, and accompanying system that treats human excrement without causing harm. Again, vulnerable people in the United States, including low-income folks in urban areas, people living in remote rural areas and communities of color, are most affected by malfunctioning or non-existent sanitation systems. And when we look at safe sanitation and stormwater, again, going back to that United Nations human right to clean water in sanitation, right, going hand in hand. When we look at safe sanitation, it's the lack of access to water and wastewater infrastructure, and also the lack of investment or resources to repair old failing infrastructure. Globally, and I know we're hear a lot from Stephen shortly on kind of the global implications of water and human right to water, but just quickly, 4.2 billion people globally lack access to safe sanitation. Nearly 2 million Americans live without running water, indoor plumbing, or access to functioning sanitation systems. 22 million people use septic tanks, which are very expensive to install, maintain, and replace when they break. And that's a big thing in Michigan that I've noticed will be taken up. Again, race is a strong predictor of water and sanitation access. While water access has improved in some regions, it's decreased in many others. And historically, historical discrimination practices such as water, sewer lines constructed not to extend into African-American communities, and pipelines built through Native American land are just a few examples of barriers to access water and water infrastructure. Some basic examples of sanitation justice. It doesn't feel abstract, right? But it's communities being left out of infrastructure improvements. It's communities living near failing water and wastewater treatment facilities. It's homeowners who cannot afford to repair their septic tanks, which we see a lot of in Michigan. People experiencing homelessness without restroom access, restrooms that are inaccessible to aging and physically, medically disabled, as well as people who are denied access to restrooms due to discrimination, right, based on race or other identities. So when we think of safe water and sanitation, it doesn't necessarily just have to be infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily just have to be your home, but literally people having access, to restrooms and sanitation. And there's just, when I think of sanitation, I always think of a great activist, Catherine Coleman Flowers out of Alabama, who spent her lifetime advocating for safe sanitation around the country and even internationally. She's a MacArthur Genius Fellow and has done just an amazing job of lifting up these issues of sanitation throughout the country. And then just to tie it in kind of briefly to Michigan's infrastructure issues as we talk about sanitation and sewage. We have 1.3 million homes and businesses on septic tanks throughout Michigan. Nearly 330,000 of those systems are failing right in Michigan. So as we talked about, sanitation and the magnitude of septic tanks and systems in Michigan, so many of those are failing. A quarter of those contaminates groundwater as well as source water. And there's no meaningful state standard regulation for septic tanks here. And my understanding is that it's potentially being taken up by the legislature. And again, just stormwater. I mean, if you've been around Michigan for the last couple of years, we've seen a number of 100-year floods. To the left are just some pictures of predominantly around Metro Detroit of communities, roads completely underwater when it rains. And then lastly, just the ways of addressing sanitation justice, looking at it through distributive justice, recognition justice, and procedural justice. With recognitional justice being, learn which groups are impacted and how they speak of water and sanitation needs for themselves. So it's seeing and hearing those impacted communities. Procedural justice, right, involving those affected groups in that work of fixing these issues of water and access to water. It's about incorporating those groups in policy and water sanitation governance. And then, it's distributive justice, right? Work to improve infrastructure to ensure equitable distribution of water and sanitation services. And I'll just end with a quote from Water Justice: Why It Matters and How we Get There. Water justice requires appreciation that there are no easy, simple, or singular solutions to the global water crisis, and that water problems cannot be resolved through technical solutions alone, but require broader recognition that they are inherently ecological, political, and social issues simultaneously. Water justice is based on principles of fairness, equity, participation, and justice. And justice has to be relational, situated, and context sensitive rather than universalistic. So I'll end right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I really appreciate your presentation. Thank you for reminding us just the racial context that we are dealing with and trying to have just amounts of water and clean water for everyone. We will invite questions after Stephen's presentation. We'll have a time for Q&A. So I trust you're going to be sticking around with us, Jeremy. And gave us a lot to be thinking about and letting us just know how far we have to go to really make it fair for everyone in the state and just many of the issues that we have to deal with. I would like now to invite up Stephen Gasteyer. He is the Associate Professor of Sociology at Michigan State University. His research focuses on community development, environmental justice, and the political ecology of landscape change, with specific attention to food, energy, water, and public health. Dr. Gasteyer was a 2015-2016 Fulbright Scholar at Birzeit University in Ramallah in the Palestinian territories. Stephen was also a research consultant on issues of global water governance at the turn of the century. He had earlier experience also in the Palestinian territories in the mid-1990s with the United Nations Association International Service, a charity in the United Kingdom, run through UNA United Kingdom to place experienced volunteers with NGOs in the Global South. During this time, he was a project worker on agroecosystem research at the Applied Research Institute of Jerusalem and the Palestine Institute for Arid Lands and Environmental Studies in the Palestinian territories. And from 1987 through 1990, he was a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Guesti.
Well, thank you very, very much. Let me start by just expressing what an honor it is to be speaking after Senator McDonald Rivet, and then after Jeremy Orr, who's somebody I terrifically admire. And then a note of gratitude to the organizers of this event. This is a really important event on an important day. Okay, so first, it's not lost on me actually that we're having that World Water Day happens to fall on the first day of Ramadan, the holy month of Ramadan. And one of the features of Ramadan is that those who are observant actually have, from early this morning, abstain not only from food all day long, they fast all day long, but also from water. And it is only at sundown that those folks will get to take their first drink of water. I have participated with, specifically when I lived in Mali, in a solidarity fast along with my brothers and sisters who were engaged in fasting. It's a Muslim country largely, and it really makes you appreciate the extent to which this element, this material in our society is life-giving. So it's particularly interesting. I also have to say, though, that we always have to acknowledge the land on which who came before us and whose land it is that we settled to be able to be here. So we actually sit now on the end of the Anishinaabe people. That's the people of the Three Fires Confederation of Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi peoples. This is land that was hostilely ceded in the Treaty of Saginaw in 1819. As such, we need to acknowledge, but also recognize that we have a debt that has to be repaid. What I will simply say as we move on is that thinking about water justice in the kind of spirit of what Jeremy Orr just had us do is one way that we can start thinking about how do we live in community with the Anishinaabe people who are amongst us, and the tribes, the 12 recognized tribes that are still in this state, and a vibrant part of our community. With that, let me turn to my assignment for the night. So I've been asked to talk about the global aspects of the human right to water and sanitation. And I'm going to do that by talking a bit about today is also, World Water Day is also an international conference. So were we in New York City right now, we would be deluged with people who are at the UN Water Conference. And then I will talk about the history of UN water conferences, which goes back quite a ways and has been a point of activism. I then will talk about the human right to water, which only emerged as an internationally recognized right in 2010, and in no small part because of civil society groups around the world advocating for the human right to water to be included as a recognized human right. And then talk a little bit about what I see as the implications. So today is the UN 2023 Water Conference. There are literally thousands of people gathered in New York City at that conference. It was in keeping with my earlier statement, it was not lost on me that amongst that is a very big delegation of Indigenous people who are there talking about water as critical to what they see as their claim of rights in a world that has been hostile to them over time. But there are lots of other advocates. There's also ongoing debates there. There are indeed civil society groups who have come to New York explicitly not to be part of this conference because they feel that there's been inadequate attention to the interests of civil society folks, which is not unrelated to our discussion. Now, I'm afraid this slide, I noted when I was trying it out, did not come out. This slide actually has a listing of all of the UN conferences. Going back to 1977, the Mar del Plata Conference was the first effort by the international community to come together to deal with water as an international issue. The United Nations, you all as UNA folks know, the United Nations, as much as anything, is a place of dialogue about important international issues. We got to the middle of the 1970s, we were in the throes of the development era, and it was recognized we need to be thinking explicitly about water. Right? At that point, some 3 billion people were estimated not to have access to water, much less sanitation. In thinking about sanitation at that point, Mar del Plata was organized to try to get us thinking about how do you address this very basic need. Now, a little context, right? When I lived in Mali in 1987, literally 1 in 5 of the children, oh God, literally 1 in 5 of the children under the age of 5 would perish by the time they reached 5, largely because of diarrheal disease, right? So you have to recognize that water, the inability to get clean water to people is in fact deadly, and deadly to our most vulnerable among our human family. So the reason to deal with this was that this has very real life and death implications, right? So the Mar del Plata conference led to the first International Water Decade from 1980 to 1990. And remarkably little progress was made. There was a lot of effort. There were a lot of things like borehole wells that were put in. But for reasons that were hard to work out, it moved the needle a little bit. A lot of infrastructure was put in, but we really didn't make all that much progress. That led to a series of efforts through the 1990s, sort of culminating in 1997 with the World Water Council's first big World Water Forum, which was in 1997 in Dublin. And that conference was where people came together, Mikhail Gorbachev and others, to declare that we needed to treat water as a commodity, as a way of getting the private sector to invest in water, because that would what would really make the difference. Now, the problem was that making the difference was seen as, you know, people were doing the gloomy math of water, right? We had 1/3 of our rivers not reaching the sea. We had increasing numbers of people who didn't have water. The scarcity, the capital wanted to invest in water because it was an increasingly scarce resource. And people saw this as concerning, especially in 1999, when they realized that privatizing water in La Paz, Bolivia, and what actually meant cutting off those who couldn't pay for the water fees. And so we saw the mobilization of civil society, along with the mobilization of those who had this vision of water as a commodity. And so we saw the formation of things called World Water Forums that took place starting in 1999, and then 2003 in Kyoto, 2006 in Istanbul, 2009 in Mexico City, where you have effectively these clashes of visions of how are we going to get to actually moving the needle on access to water internationally. And all of this leads us up to 2010. So you have what you have is increasing concern about privatization on the one hand, increasing interest in privatization on the other. People recognizing that privatization while it may have led to greater investment, was also leading to fewer people actually accessing clean water in places where water rates were going up. Detroit being our local example, but you could have Manila, Philippines, Mexico City, Johannesburg, and Soweto, right? All of these places, you had people who were saying, wait, we can no longer afford to, but yes, maybe the quality's improved, but we still can't access it. This is not the solution. And so in 1999, the UN Commission on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, under civil society pressure, puts out a statement saying, oh, actually, there should be a human right to water and sanitation. That under the UN Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, wasn't mentioned. Mostly they say because everyone presumed, right? The right to dignity has to involve the right to water, but it wasn't stated explicitly. So the civil society was saying it needs to be there. And so at all these 2003, 2006, 2009, these forums come together, people are saying there needs to be a human right to water and sanitation. These same civil society groups figure out that there's an opening at the UN General Assembly in 2010 and move in and start lobbying using the Spanish, Bolivian, and Peruvian ambassadors as the leads. And lo and behold, they pass. The UN General Assembly passes in 2010 the recognition of the human right to water and sanitation, acknowledging the importance of equitable access to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation as an integral part of the realization of all human rights, reaffirming the responsibility of states for the promotion and protection of human rights, which are universal, indivisible, and interrelated, and must be treated globally in a fair and equitable manner, and recognizing the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation as a human right that is essential for the full enjoyment of life and all human rights. Now, notably, it passed unanimously, but there were 47 abstentions. Our nation was one of those abstentions. Right? As was Canada, France, Israel, right? So, but the United States had actively worked against, and the mobilization was to get them to abstain and not to object. So it would pass unanimously. So this law passes. It has within it these basic normative elements. The important thing to note here, right? Access, right? This whole notion that we can we're going to pay to improve the water system and then it's going to be so expensive you can't access it. No, wait a minute, that's a violation of the human right, right? It needs to be safe, right? So the whole notion that we have Flint, right? Where you have, yeah, water comes through the tap, but do you want to drink that lead contaminated water? No, it needs to be sufficient, right? So just getting water for 3 hours a day, that isn't meeting the right to water and sanitation. But then then affordability. But no, again, Jeremy Orr said that the Flint water crisis was really a crisis of democracy. Note the bottom 3 points: non-discrimination, access to information, participation, further. But the second thing they do, and this is very important, is that when invited, they will come to a state to write about the implementation or the violations of the human right to water and sanitation. And it was this mechanism that brought Caterina de Albuquerque to Detroit in 2010 to report on the violation of the human right to water and sanitation with 47,000 water shutoffs. But Caterina de Albuquerque was very active. She did lots and lots of these reports. I think she did upwards of 30 reports during her tenure, which ended in about 2016, 2017. Leo Heller was much more interested in trying to understand some of the very tricky codification issues. But he's no slouch, and Pedro Arroyo Aguda is very interested in thinking about things like financialization of water, which is a sort of a jargon term, but something that could have a lot of implications. So that the mechanism is basically that they get invited, they come, they write the report, and then the government is compelled to respond to it. Right there, the UN ambassador is called to say, okay, so here's this report, what happened here? All right. Now, all of this fits into a broader UN process around water as an entity. And so we mentioned, I believe you mentioned at the beginning, the significance of Sustainable Development Goal number 6, which is the goal of universal access to water and sanitation by 2030. Notable, I talked about the international decade from 1981 to 1990, right? And the goal then was, oh, everyone's back. Hello, everyone. The goal in the 1980s was universal access to water and sanitation. There was a lot of hand wringing after 1990 because we were so far from meeting that goal. The Millennium Development Goals, which were implemented at the Johannesburg Sustainable Development and Environment Conference in 2002, actually then took a step back, said, actually, what we want to do is have the percent of the population lacking access to water and sanitation by 2015. The notion being that they could, well, let's make this a more concrete goal, and let's figure out how are we going to move the bar on that. And sure enough, the Millennium Development Goals were declared a success in 2013, 2014. They have the population lacking access to water and sanitation. I'll get to that in a minute. The Sustainable Development Goals then were negotiated, and again, civil society got into the room and said, come on, really the best we can do is to have the population lacking access to water and sanitation. And so the goal again is by 2030 to succeed in universal access to water and sanitation, recognizing that access to water and sanitation is central to the majority of those other 16 Sustainable Development Goals. The problem is actually when you start looking at the numbers, and this is a nice overview, right? We're looking at about 844 million who don't even have access to the most basic sources of water, right? These are people, and we've all seen the pictures on late night television of people walking miles with a calabash on their head to get water. That's those folks. 2.3 billion, however, is the the population, and any of you, those of you who read the Lansing State Journal saw an article on this morning in I think it was page 6 or something, right? That 2.3 billion, fully a quarter of the population don't have access to safe water, safe and clean water, right? And then Jeremy Orr talked about the population who lack access to sanitation, which is even more daunting. So there's a lot of work yet to be done, right? The trick is what we count. And so if we had been having this conversation using UN statistics in 2010, we'd have been highlighting that 870 million number and talking about how actually now that chart was a bit out of date. We've got something like 745 million people who lack access. That's too many, but it sounds a lot better than 2.5 billion. And the issue was this: the UN used to count these folks in the top picture as having access to a water source and having access to clean water, because you presume that if it's coming out of a borehole well, it's clean. The problem is that it may or may not be. And in fact, in one of the research projects I did in Tanzania, part of what we ended up looking at was how people got water into their house. And they could get, through the clean source, they could get about a third of what they needed for their household needs, which left them getting the rest of their water from other places, right? So what you count makes a big difference. And I would actually argue that while the numbers look less good, what you count, we're actually doing a better job of counting. And what that means is that among other things, the United Nations has moved from acting like the United States has universal access to potable water and sanitation to recognizing that there are major pockets in the United States who don't, right? Because the second part of this is, what are the units you're counting? In the late 1990s, we were only looking at percentages of the entire population. The human right to water and sanitation meant we were thinking about individual and valuing each individual who didn't have access to water and sanitation. So it has changed dramatically the way we think about this issue and what the challenge is and the extent to which we can exceptionalize it to those folks over there. This is really a global problem. The second thing that this leads to, though, is in what you count, we can start thinking about technologies. The presumption for decades was if we got the technology right, we would solve access to water and sanitation. And so we were busy counting sources, places where we put in borehole wells. And then by extension, thinking about ever higher abstractions of the kinds of resources we needed to get people access to water and sanitation. This is not to say that there's no role for technological innovation. It is to say that 90% of the problem of getting people access to water and sanitation is not about new ever more fancy technology. It's about power. It's about democracy. It's about allowing people to be part of the conversation about how to get them access to the resources they need. Oh, and one more thing. The latest technologies that are in discussion right now have to do with fancy market solutions. Can we financialize water? And if we have more fancy financial instruments that encourage investment, won't that just naturally mean that more people get access to water? Again, getting more money in to help people get access to water isn't necessarily a bad thing, but let's not pretend that it's going to happen by magic. And let's not pretend that if we let the financial managers take it over, that it's going to necessarily mean that any of the rest of us get better access, right? So this is where my experience in Palestine comes in. As I start to recognize that water, the access to water, access to sanitation is a matter of power. Israel, if you look at the publications about who's doing the most innovative work on delivering new water to scarce water places, it's Israel. They have the highest amount of wastewater treatment and reuse. They have the highest amount of water that's coming through desal. It is one of the most innovative, technologically innovative countries in the world in delivering water to a place where water is scarce. The problem is that water is not delivered equally to all people. The top chart shows that Israelis routinely get access to abundant water resources, whereas Palestinians in the West Bank get something like a third of those resources, less than the WHO recommended amount. And if you're in Gaza, 97% of the water sources in Gaza are not considered safe and potable, right? So, and while Israel touts its technological acumen in producing new water, they have been actively involved in keeping those conditions that way in Palestine and for Palestinians. So one of the sources I cite is called Water Justice in Palestine. They pointed out that a Negev community of Bedouin inside Israel just had their water source and their communal infrastructure bulldozed for the 473rd time 2 days ago. So this is, water becomes a weapon, and it becomes a weapon that gets used as part of a settler colonial struggle. And it is in some ways then the ideal type of water and water access being about power and not just about availability of resources and technology. But the other thing to keep in mind as we close out is remembering that all of this is not to say that our natural environment, the ecosystem, is not impacting the availability of water. So if we look at water stress by country, one of the things you can see, not clearly because it's too small a map, is that the water stress, those places that don't have access to water, are predominantly in the global south, and their conditions are being exacerbated by climate change, where the dry land is becoming drier, where water sources are being flooded out by more severe rains. So we have to keep in mind that access to water and sanitation is going to be dependent on addressing the other bigger ecosystem issues. But procedural rights but we also have to recognize this is a basic human right. This is about basic human dignity, the ability to eat, the ability to drink, the ability to bathe, but it's also about basic democracy. So I'll close with that. And I don't know, I probably used up all our time for questions.
We have 15 minutes.
Oh, fantastic.
Well, 10 minutes, because we have a couple things to close with. First of all, do we have any questions online?
Let's give it a round of applause.
Oh, yes, thank you. Sorry, I jumped right into things here. Moving right along. Yeah, are there any questions online? Doesn't look like there. Just to mention. Yeah, if you have those online, if you have any questions, please put those in the chat and we will gladly answer those. And let me invite the folks in the room here, if you have any questions. Over here. Of water and the role of democracy, and the role of justice as well. My question is, it's clear about how important infrastructure is, how important democratic how important access is. I wonder what the solutions or what solutions you might think about in terms of affordability. Here we get to a commodity that is going to be paid for in some way. And access can be given, but it comes at a price. We solve this issue of affordability plus in some solutions, right? We're going to have incentives to invest in infrastructure, so that also will come at a price and a return. So is it price subsidies to lower that when we do the private market? Is it increased tax and public sector funds? So I'm just curious about that issue around affordability justice. You hear that, Jeremy? You're wondering about affordability justice. You want to take that?
It was really hard to hear. If you could repeat the question that you heard, that'd be helpful.
I will maybe. Okay. Okay, from the beginning, just kidding. Can you hear me, Jeremy?
Yes, I can hear.
Okay, so my question was about some things from the talk that were, well, let me cut to the chase. How do we deal with the issue of affordability justice? Access is clearly important, but how do we deal with the fact that this is a commodity that needs to be paid for in some way? And how do we make it so that that payment is more just? What solutions might you recommend in terms of doing that? And I was thinking of, private sector gets involved in investments of the resources and creating infrastructure, but do we subsidize prices, or do we use local governments and local utilities to charge cross subsidies of rates? So just on that question of affordability justice. Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. And I think I'll start with something that Stephen said, which was like there was a decision to commodify water, right? And I think just the idea that we're looking at water as a commodity is the problem to begin with, right? In a place where we have an abundance of water, oftentimes you hear about the scarcity of water, right? But I think the data has shown that there's not a scarcity of water; it's a scarcity of how we distribute water and who has access to it. Right. So I think starting with the idea that water isn't a commodity, it wasn't a commodity and never should have been seen as a commodity to be bought and sold. I think that's the first thing, right? Changing the way that we think about it. And then that gets us into the mind frame of being able to say, okay, if we're not looking at it as a full-on commodity or as what some people have framed as a public commodity where you kind of toe the line of, okay, we're going to charge for it, but it needs to be reasonable. I think one of the things that we've mostly looked at, and I think we're going to see in Michigan at least, is, subsidized rate structures that allow people to have access to water, taking into account income and ability to pay, right? So instead of the idea that everybody pays the same thing for the same amount of water and attach it to that usage, right? It's looking at, okay, everybody should have access to water. And instead of charging for volume consumed, it should be based on income and ability to pay. And that does look like in many other instances, right? It looks like, those of higher income, right, will probably pay a bit more for water than those are lower income and those under a certain poverty threshold. But that isn't very different from the way we look at other, some other utilities as well. But I think the biggest thing there, it's going back to seeing it as a commodity when we never should have.
Yeah, I'll just add, Jeremy's response was fabulous. I will just add that there are there are efforts right now going on to figure out how you do that in a way that that allows systems to keep delivering the services that are necessary. So there are things like lifeline rates that we right now don't allow in Michigan, that were prohibited in a number of the World Bank loan conditions that rate economists are now saying, oh, wait, maybe we need to think about those things. The other thing is really thinking about there's a theory called full cost recovery, which argues that any given entity ought to be responsible for accounting for or recovering the full cost of delivering water. And the reality is that in poor places, this is really problematic, especially poor places where they've had abandonment or they have very old systems. This is in effect the Detroit story, right? They have Detroit has a system that is vastly bigger than the population that lives there, that was dependent on industries that have subsequently left. And so there are economists out there who are concerned about affordability, who are saying, why should Detroit have to pay the full cost of that? That doesn't make sense. It's not the people who are in Detroit now who chose to build the system out, right?
Great, thank you, Stephen. I saw that Terry had a hand up. I'll give you a chance to ask your question.
Thank you both for your presentations. Jeremy, it's so good to see you. Actually, I think my question can go to both of you. It's you, Jeremy, in your presentation, you listed on one of those slides that there are 100 chemicals being assessed. Yet we know that there's some 50,000 chemicals that have been produced and put out there in various combinations. What's the process both nationally for going beyond those 100, and especially, and then again, globally, what's going on with looking at the chemicals that are, like all the plastics and the bioplastics that are breaking down?
Yeah, sure thing. And I think one prime example of that is what we're seeing now with PFAS over the last few years, right? Where we know a number of these chemicals have been regulated and contaminants have been regulated, but PFAS is one that they've just allowed to fester for decades. And now we're seeing that process of, the health and the health-based data showing up and saying, okay, there are very clear implications, health implications on human health, on the environment, on animals, right? And I think it took a while for us to get there. And that's a normal process, I think, for any of these kind of contaminants and chemicals, right? It's the scientific data that shows it. You then, depending on who's doing it, right, you're petitioning the federal government, in our instance, oftentimes EPA, to begin a rulemaking process, right? That rulemaking process has been initiated. It goes through public comment period, goes through scientific review. And then you make that determination. You have these draft rules and you have the final rules, and you make that determination on what's being regulated and how to regulate it based on the science and data. But to your point, there are so many other contaminants that just simply are not on the book, simply have not made it there. And I think that's on us to continue to push, right? Continue to push government, continue to push EPA or our state regulators, because they still have our state regulators can regulate these contaminants as well, even if EPA isn't. So I think it's on us to continue to push there. And to your point, I think we're seeing the same, some of the same things globally, right, with those contaminants, as more and more polluters are being kind of held accountable, and we're discovering the long-term implications of pollution that we've allowed for the last few decades. Also kind of moving in that same direction. And oftentimes, and Stephen can probably speak to this, it feels like, internationally, a lot of places are ahead of us on regulating many of these contaminants, and we've fallen kind of pretty far behind.
You have something you'd like to add?
Just to say, Jeremy's absolutely right, that there's a process, and it's a process that's responsive to to the squeaky wheels. So, the more that we advocate for attention to chemical regulation, the more that there's going to be response, at least to our advocacy. And he's absolutely right as well that there are a lot of places that are ahead of us. PFAS is case in point. Australia, many of the parts of the European Union had different national environmental bodies had already passed regulations. We are just now catching up. But what I really wanted to say is there is also a World Health Organization body that deliberates about what are the regulated chemicals for international water standards. And so there's a process very much like what we do here that happens within the UN system through the World Health Organization.
Great. I want to thank all three of our speakers, actually, but the senator's not here, but thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I learned an awful lot. It gives me too much to think about. My head's hurting already. Thank you so much. Do want to remind you that we do have a suggestion. Well, we have our co-sponsors listed up here again. I want to thank each of our co-sponsors for being a part of tonight's program. And I know a number of the people who are online and some in the room here who are also from these different organizations. So thank you so much for being a part of this evening. Do want to remind you that there's an opportunity for an advocacy action. And what we want to do, as the senator mentioned earlier, we'd like you to contact your state senator that there is a bill out there, Senate Bill 25, and to ask them to get that bill moving so that it gets out of committee and onto the floor for a vote. So we'll be sending out some information on that online in the future here, so you'll have more. And you can see here is the information that you can look up if you want to look about the bill. And finally, I want to invite up Mary Flores. She is our Vice President of Membership, and I want to say a few words about it.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much to everybody that's here, to our speakers. For those of you that are GLUNA members, thank you very much. Your participation in GLUNA allows us to put on events like this. If you go to our webpage, we have our calendar of all our events on the webpage, and please join us at our future events also. And there is also a button on the webpage for join us. And so if you're not a member, we invite you to join us, become a GLUNA member, and we hope to see you at our future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mary, as well. I just want to thank all of you for being here. I hope that you found this very meaningful for you as I did. And just know that, there's much that we have to do. We celebrate our successes, but remember that we have a lot of work to do. And I thank you for being here, and for those of you online, and for all of your willingness to be a part of the work that we have to do to make this a better world. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening. Go green.